So this is a conversation with Nadia and Alia from the Queer Arabs podcast. We spoke about what it's like to host a podcast about LGBTQ Arabs, the guests they have on, and how queer Arab activism has changed in recent years. We of course especially focused on the period of time since the 2011 uprisings and the aftermaths, including, for example, the recent crackdowns in Egypt. We also spoke about why representation and visibility matter, and the difficulties of tackling both homophobia in Arab spaces while also struggling against forms of homo-nationalism that use LGBTQ rights to push for anti-Arab/Muslim hatred. Finally, we also spoke about what's next for the Queer Arabs podcast and what is next for them personally. Just a quick trigger warning first, we do talk about suicide as we mentioned Sarah Higazi's death. And on the more technical side, I will apologize from now for the echoes that you'll hear. They shouldn't be too much of a bother, but basically I'm in the middle of a move, so the sound quality isn't as good as it might be otherwise. This will probably still be the case for the next few episodes, but after that we'll go back to normal. So thank you for your patience on that. So as usual, you can follow the podcast on Twitter @FireTheseTimes, and if you like what I do, please consider supporting this project with only $1 a month on Patreon on buymeacoffee.com. And you can also do so directly on PayPal if you prefer. Patreon is for monthly, PayPal is for one-offs, and Buy Me a Coffee has both options. And if you cannot donate, you can still help by reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcast. Thank you.
My name's Alia, and I go by she, her, or they is fine. And my family is Saudi, one side of the family. The other side is white American. I grew up in the United States, currently in DC, and we started a podcast a couple years ago called The Queer Arabs.
Hey, I'm Nadia. I'm quarantining also in DC. I'm Lebanese American, she or they pronouns. And I've recently gotten on board with this podcast as a co-host.
So let's talk about the podcast. How did it come about? What was your intended purpose, let's say, while starting it, and how have you seen it? Because now you've done 121 episodes at least so far.
Yeah.
So that's quite an achievement already. Congratulations. So
Thank you.
Let's talk a bit about its history.
Cool. Yeah. So in March 2018, it was kind of a spur of the moment decision because I had been looking on iTunes just out of curiosity. I was like, I wonder if there's anything like queer and Arab that pop up under podcasts. And I couldn't find, at the time, I just couldn't find anything. And then the co-host named Ellie, who has not been on recently because she's been at her mom's house and doesn't have the privacy needed. But anyway, so Ellie and I just kind of talked about how we weren't finding that particular topic on iTunes, and then I was like, I wonder what would happen if we tried if we tried making a couple episodes, how do you start a podcast? And then we kind of took it step by step and ended up putting out 3 episodes, I think, back to back, just as an experiment. They weren't good. They were we didn't have good equipment. We didn't know what to talk about. Yeah. And I don't know. I don't think I'll ever go back and listen to them myself. But I then got in contact with Shiam, who is a friend of ours. And I was like, hey, what would you think about coming on as a guest on this podcast? And it just kept going from there. We ended up having guests on almost every episode, and we are not running out of things to talk about. That was what I was afraid of toward the beginning. I was like, I feel like we're gonna hit a wall eventually. And
there's no wall.
There's no wall. This podcast it feels like it's just starting still, because there's just so many amazing people that we are getting connected with, and
Yeah.
And I think Nadia said she joined kind of recently as a co-host. I think it's been a while actually.
I can talk about my involvement.
Yeah.
So Alia was coming to New York, where I lived pre-COVID, a lot to podcast at events for a certain period, and we kind of connected and we're hanging out there a lot. And sometimes I would like co-host at an event we were doing, or co-host if I like knew the guest or knew what they were doing. And it was so I've kind of been like gradually getting more involved. And then when I got here and had nothing to do for the first few weeks of quarantine, kind of stepped in more concretely. I guess I want to say I feel like the whole purpose of this podcast has really shifted, and like the whole landscape it's in. I mean, even just 2 years ago, it seems weird thinking about it like in the historical times of 2018. But I think y'all came into it being like, we don't see a lot of, not that there weren't like creators and organizers out there, but I think it was just hard for people to find each other at the time. It was like, you would Google Queer Arabs and not much would come up in like a very basic visibility sense. And I think y'all kind of started from like okay, we're gonna create, quote unquote, create representation, and now it's so much more about like kind of connecting different branches of artists and organizers, and just like connecting different facets of this community and directing them towards each other more than like we are the ones creating the thing, you know?
Yeah, exactly. I feel like now this podcast in my mind has always belonged to everyone in a way, but I feel that more than ever now. Like, I feel like this is such a collective project, and that's what I love about it. I don't think of it as like, oh, this podcast belongs to any particular person. And that's something that I love about the format we have. And like,
I think the long, I guess this is probably something you've thought about too with creating this podcast that we're doing right now, but just the long form podcast format, I think makes a lot of people comfortable, because something that a lot of people we've talked to hate about a lot of the press they've gotten is the way it kind of either takes what they say out of context or pins them into like very specific stereotypes, like either you're just oppressed or you're just flashy and fun. You know, and I think we can talk about like better ways of doing all kinds of media, but just kind of giving a lot of space where you can talk for yourself in however many ways feels right. It can be just a format that allows for more complexity.
Yeah, like an example I'm thinking of, and this is kind of related to what Nadia is saying, is Maljudeen we had on. And one thing that we got to talking about is like, as soon as there was like positive press about Tunisia related to LGBT rights, that's what the world knew.
And it got like blown. It wasn't even correct.
It got very.
It was like there's gay marriage in Tunisia,
right? And it got so. It was so oversimplified and like
and blown up,
and that's something that we talked about with that guest about just like how we need to have these deeper conversations with people who, like in this case, with people who live in Tunisia and actually understand the situation, rather than just like, you know, all of these articles that were going around about like Tunisia is, you know, it's solved, like the LGBT issue.
We fixed Tunisia.
We fixed it. Yeah. So that's been a helpful, a benefit, I guess. A helpful benefit of this format of long form conversation.
No, for sure. And I realized while you were talking that, I mean, when you mentioned Shiam, I was asking myself, is it the same Shiam? But then it's not even a common name. And yes, we're talking about the same Shiam.
Of course we are. Of course you know. Yeah, she's pretty. Wait, you had her?
Yeah, I had her on just a few weeks ago.
Wait, okay.
Yeah.
Let's go back and listen to
this.
We
will. Oh my God.
I know her quite well by now.
She's awesome.
She is pretty good. Yeah,
she's amazing. Yeah.
So on the format, I mean, obviously, I agree since I'm also doing this now, and it's been something. I launched this in the middle of the pandemic, so mid-March, and it was the really. I mean, I've been thinking about why did I launch this podcast, but really the alternative was just not working for me. I was unable to write for a while. And talking about why that was the case felt more useful, essentially, which is how it kind of started. And like the slogan on the website, like the de facto philosophy, I suppose, of the Queer Era podcast is like, we exist, Mawjudeen. And
Yeah.
can we talk a bit about well, it probably to you, for I mean, it's going to be self-evident, but for those who may not be as familiar, let's say, why does it matter so much to actually say that we exist? And I mean, even asking that question sounds utterly ridiculous, but let's talk about it anyway.
Sure. Yeah. Actually, I'll go back to the beginning of the podcast. At first, that little slogan said there are at least 4 of us, because it was like Ellie and me, and then 2 people who were doing the Arabic side of the podcast.
Yeah.
And so at first it just said like there are at least 4 of us. And I feel like the fact that we changed it to we exist is very symbolic of like how things have just like changed, at least for us. Because at first we felt like we just weren't finding a lot of queer Arabs to connect with. That's just where we were at the beginning.
Yeah.
And then eventually I just felt like this slogan doesn't make any sense anymore, because there are at least thousands of us, like we just keep connecting with people. And so then we changed it to we exist. And yeah, I feel like the significance of just, I think it's a very powerful political statement to say like, we're here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess I think of 2 main reasons why like that seems important to me. I think first, like personally, there's the idea like in Arab communities, and I think especially here, it's the idea that like, no, our people don't do that. That's like an American thing.
Yeah.
And like if you're being queer, that's because you're Americanized and you've been corrupted, blah 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 blah. And then kind of on the other hand, like a similar, or like the mirror image coming from certain like American whitewashed queer communities. Like if you're queer and you want to participate in queer culture, then you have to totally separate from that other culture that you grew up in. Like that doesn't belong here.
Right.
And there's not on both sides it's the same thing. It's just not acknowledging that those 2 things can coexist. And for me, like for a while I bought into that idea, and I thought that like to be myself I needed to assimilate into this very like whitewashed queer scene, which eventually I realized didn't entirely speak to me either.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think on a broader political level, and I think this like different versions of this could be said in each context, but I think I'm going to speak to like how certain ideas have been used in American politics lately, like American homo nationalism, like the idea that like using the idea of like the LGBTQ community, which we assume is just American, I guess, and saying that we need to, and using that as a prop for xenophobia. Like, I think the biggest image I can think of this is like Trump holding up a bad like LGBTQ sign at his rallies before he got elected, and saying things like justifying the Muslim ban with like, we need to keep these people out to protect the LGBTQ community. Of course, he doesn't give a fuck about like queer people in the US even, but it's also the idea that like those things aren't simultaneous, that there aren't queer people in any of the countries you're banning that could be speaking for themselves, and whether this is beneficial to them in any way. And I think, I think in a lot of political climates, but including in this one, those identities have kind of been pitted against each other, and with really really terrible ends. Like that's been used to push along Trump's campaign after the Orlando shooting, and it's been used to push the Muslim ban. And I think just saying that we exist kind of ruptures that narrative.
Yeah, pushes back on that. And I said at the beginning of the podcast a lot, like, that there was this compartmentalization that we had to do so much of, like, if you're in an Arab space, you're in an Arab space. If you're in a queer space, you're just a queer space.
Right.
You can't combine the two. Otherwise, everything will implode. People won't understand.
Something bad is going to happen. We don't know what, but it's not good.
You cannot overlap the two. And then also there was this experience in Houston where an Arab American community center, they were offering the use of space because they wanted to get a certain age group to start using it, because it was always like children or like older people who would attend events there, and so they were really trying to get that age gap filled. So I brought up the idea of like an LGBT social group or support group in this really beautiful empty space that they had that wasn't used very much, and the response we got was the community isn't ready. And so that spoke to, I mean, that just said everything. Like just that sentence, it was like, okay, so you are saying I'm not part of the community, despite the fact that I check the box of Arab, but because I'm asking to have like a queer related social space, all of a sudden I am on the outside of this little bubble that you perceive to have, and like you're not acknowledging the people who do exist in your community. And so I thought when I like changed that little slogan on our website, that came to mind too. It was kind of like I don't know if we can swear on this podcast.
Yeah, you
No,
can.
I already said fuck.
Oh, okay.
I said Trump doesn't give a fuck.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I didn't even notice. That's just, but yeah, so it was kind of like a fuck you to that community center and to all contexts, to all spaces that do that to people, and to like dismiss such large percentages of the population like that, and just like pretend that we don't exist.
I mean, it's an act of violence in itself. It's not recognized as such, and I think that's part of the problem, obviously. But the evolution from I don't know if we can call it an evolution, but let's say like the evolution from there's at least four of us to we exist. It just reminds me of the recent conversation you've had also with Tariq Muhammad on your podcast, and because he said something that really hit home, which is that not wanting the next generation to go through the traumatizing events that we are going through in this generation. So kind of really thinking about the future essentially. And I mean, although my experience personally, I'm straight and cis, so it's obviously not the same. I do recognize the impulse with what's happening right now in Lebanon in general, with the crisis in general. It's just something that you feel as well. Like when Tariq said this, did it really echo with you? How would you interpret it, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to like equate anyone's experiences, but I think just in general, like we all experience different types of trauma in various ways and to various degrees. And I think what he says just really speaks to the type of person he is, because I feel like there's people who are like, because I experienced this, I want to inflict it on other people in the future. And that's how we get like all the trauma cycles that we're in. And then there's people who are like, because I experienced it, I want to make sure
to stop
no one else does. Yeah.
Yeah. I would agree with Nadia. I think like just wanting to finally do something to end a cycle. Like someone has to do it eventually.
I think one thing you said is like, I don't think we're the most qualified people to do it, but like someone needs to.
Right.
Yeah, I agree, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, sorry.
Oh no, and just like the fact that this now is such a collective experience with the podcast. I don't feel that anymore. I don't feel like, oh, I'm not qualified to do this. I'm like, no, I'm part of this community. I have a place here. Everyone has a place here.
Yeah, and I think it's multiplying, you know, like once you
Yeah.
connect to a few people, you connect to more people, and then that gives other people like more support or inspiration to go do their own thing, which is great.
Totally.
Yeah.
You mentioned something along the same lines in the episode on Sarah Higazi. And at the beginning, I'll record a separate intro mentioning trigger warnings and everything, of course.
Yeah.
Okay.
The response after she took her own life, really felt like this was a different moment from like we saw there was a small vigil, I think, in Lebanon. There was definitely quite. I went to one in here in Geneva. And there was quite a lot of them in the States and in Canada, of course. Canada. How did you feel that moment? And obviously describe it in however you feel most comfortable. And would you agree that it did feel like a different moment in at least in the, because like, so to expand a bit, like the negative stuff was still there. They didn't go away. The hatred, the horrific things that Adam mentioned on the podcast, and maybe if you don't mind to kind of tell those who haven't listened to the podcast about that as well. He referring to like the fact that he I think, if I remember well, like on Facebook, he saw families and like friends from childhood friends and everything actually also being openly homophobic towards her and stuff. So like that still existed. Obviously, like we're not pretending that things were just fixed overnight. Sure. But there was it felt like the moment of solidarity was much greater this time than, unfortunately, with previous cases of either suicides or horrific, other horrific cases. Would you agree with that?
That was my perception. I felt, I mean, I did see a lot of negative comments online and stuff, but I felt like there
was a sense of collective mourning. I
felt like that was more powerful.
Should we give some background on Sarah Higazi?
Please do.
Yeah. So for a bit of background, she was a Egyptian activist in a lot of regards, but one of them is being an openly queer woman. She was arrested after raising a rainbow flag at a Mashrua Leila concert in, was it 2017?
2017.
Yeah. And was arrested and tortured in really terrible ways. Later, I think got asylum and was living in Canada and continued to be an activist. Was really looked up to in the community. Recently took her own life for, and that's obviously really complicated, but in addition to just like the effects of what torture and trauma does to people, one thing that was mentioned was that due to her legal status, she couldn't access mental health care. So that's just kind of, a lot of things have come up about this for a lot of people, but I think one of them is just the idea that like leaving isn't the like end all answer. Like it's not, like for some people that's, they see that as like, oh, that's the end point, that's success, she got out. And I think a lot of people maybe like look to that like, oh, if I can just leave, but it's not like it's the effects of what you've experienced don't go away, and like the US isn't a safe space, and Canada isn't necessarily a safe space. Same for like Europe or wherever you're looking at as the end point. And I think it kind of, that point I think shattered a certain like idea that maybe some people have been clinging on to. I think just a lot of knowledge that she's someone we know about, and obviously there's more people. Like she was a very open, known activist, but obviously there's so many other queer people in and from the region who have done similar things, and like we never maybe some of us know personally, and maybe some of us will never really get to know the real reason. One thing that came up surrounding Sarah was there's a website called, I think, like for queers who can't mourn in public.
Yeah,
yes,
it was
Yeah.
about like queer grief and how a lot of that has to be done anonymously.
Right. Like there's people who are taking their lives in without being able to say it publicly, and there's people who are grieving without being able to say publicly because that's not safe for them. And I think so there's I think there's collective mourning going on multiple levels. Like yes, there's the vigils, and then there's also the people who can't safely go to a vigil, and in various ways are still able to express themselves and find each other. But
it has brought up the idea of like the right to grieve and how not everyone is given that right still to go through the, like, whether it's ritualistic or not, whatever a person needs to do, a lot of times like they can't openly take all those steps, and it's because of like fear for themselves and fear for like what others will do to them if they find out like, oh, this is something relatable to me because of the queer aspect. And for example, so that I think that website has kind of like highlighted that as an issue that's just like not very often discussed.
And I think like obviously it's about Sarah as a person, like she's not all, and I don't want to make that jump, but like in addition to being about her as a person, like I think the collective mourning has also been just like releasing of all the like unsaid and like latent grief that's been kind of hidden in other contexts.
Right. And also like what Nadia said, the after arriving in like a country that maybe you're seeking asylum in or whatever, like there needs to be a discussion of what happens next. It's not just it's over, everything's resolved.
Sometimes like the story, like the news, we talked about like how news stories like cut things short and like spice them up, and sometimes it's like that's like the happy ending in the news story, like oh, you got to Canada, but that's not life.
It's like someone with PTSD is now in a new environment without family,
which can be racist and have a bunch of legal challenges. And
and I think that got people talking about that. And just the fact that like all this happened to her because of raising a flag.
It's important to re-emphasize that at the end of the day, that was that was all she did at that concert.
Right.
It may have not even been it is a political statement by default, I guess, because the personal is political in this case. But it was just a moment of joy at a concert, a Mishra Leila concert. Obviously, not a coincidence that it's Mishra Leila, whose frontman is openly queer.
Right.
And it was that photo, of course, the one of her, happy with the flag and on top of someone's shoulder.
Right now.
This is a moment where I would imagine she felt like this was a safe space, and the fact that it was followed by all of this really makes it all the more difficult, I think, to think about. And what happened to her, her story, and same as you, it's very difficult to talk about something that is so difficult already due to how the story ended, I guess, or part of it anyway, because we don't want to just reduce her to a story, obviously. But unfortunately, a big part of the problem in our region is also how I believe Tariq also mentioned this, if I remember correctly. How also there is the tendency in many of our, let's say, quote unquote, our circles, which is difficult to say, in the sense of like progressive leftist circles,
right,
to sometimes not talk about this, and to even say like in Lebanese Arabic, like هلا مش وقتها, like now is not the time for it.
Yeah.
And I wonder if we can talk a bit about the fact that when we say this to someone, like when a non, and here I'm saying we vaguely, because when I'll just speak for myself. If I tell a queer Lebanese, for example, that now is not the time to talk about LGBTQ rights, and let's fix the country first, and then we figure that out. That's the common thing that we often hear. How do you actually tackle this? Because I mean, I can only imagine how frustrating this must be and how exhausting this must be. So how do you discuss it? Because I know this is something that you've discussed in your podcast as well.
Yeah, I think that first response is like, okay, well, when is when everything else is perfect and there's no problems in the government, like is that going to happen, or are you just saying never? Like, that's just not realistic. And then maybe this is getting.
They are saying never, I suppose. At the end of the day, that is the.
When Lebanon has this perfect, shiny, functional government, like,
of course.
Yeah, then we start working on this. Like, when? But okay, maybe this is getting a little too theoretical, but I also think like it's not unrelated. The way we were talking about how like gender is related to sectarianism and nationalism and our ideas of like what it means to be a leader. Like, we can't recreate systems under patriarchal ideals of leadership and then just shift them. Like, that's not going to happen. I think ideally, if we're considering like feminism and queer inclusion and liberation from the beginning in any movement, that's not just like an add-on, that's going to shape the type of leadership that's being created.
And then you mentioned the link between sectarianism in the context of Lebanon, sectarianism and gender, sectarianism and patriarchy. We could say the same about nationalism more broadly in places like Egypt and
Totally.
Well, that's kind of a global phenomenon, but since we're focusing on the region, you mentioned we mentioned in the beginning, like you're half Saudi and Lebanese. Are these identities that I don't even know how to ask this question. This is the problem whenever we get into vague or theoretical territory. I don't actually know how to formulate the question without sounding ridiculous, so I'll just say it.
Okay.
We're podcasters. We get it. We deal with this too.
Have you seen if you want to focus on Saudi Arabia and Lebanon and maybe Egypt as kind of tangentially, just because I know you've been talking about it a lot on the podcast.
Right.
Have you seen the movement towards LGBTQ rights, however vague that sounds in the first place? Have you seen a change in the past few years? Has it been a mainly diaspora thing, which doesn't demean its importance? Obviously, it would just speak to how dangerous it would be back home, of course. Have you seen more of an openness, more of a relative openness? Yeah, like how would you actually think about the situation, notwithstanding the ongoing pandemic and the crisis and, in the respective countries and so on?
So from conversations I've had and from what I observe related to Saudi Arabia, I feel like what we're seeing is all very surface level, and whereas in reality, like on a deeper level, there is progress among society, but like that's not being conveyed to the rest of the world. And it's because there's this still kind of a hush-hush mentality of like, okay, I'm going to support you, but like I can't be public about it. So that's been my personal observation of like, it's been easier over time to have personal conversations, at least with some family members. And then like I've connected with other like queer Saudis, but everything just kind of happens on the DL, and there's no like real, I just haven't seen like public displays of support. So I feel like that there's something to me that's very shallow about that, and I hope that aspect will change. I think
like when people say like I support you, but I would never say that.
But like,
to
don't tell
else.
anyone else. Yeah. In the past 4 years or so, 5 years, there has been a lot of like more artistic expression in Saudi Arabia, and going and coming with that has been like these, I don't know, like there has definitely been a correlation between that and the limited progress I just mentioned, related to like LGBT related conversations that are finally happening, which I guess just goes with the concept of expressing oneself. So it makes sense that it is happening at the same time that like artistic expression is more and more possible. So that's what I, I know I can't like speak for everyone, but that's just like what I have seen. I think on the US side, like in the diaspora side, I have met several queer Saudis, and that's kind of a new thing for me, and that's been cool. And just like being able to talk about the experience with others has been like personal progress for me. Yeah.
In terms of Lebanon, I feel like, well, first of all, like, yes, totally. I feel like there's been a bunch of progress regarding like organizing, but also with like caveats on that. Like Halam has been doing great work. Lebmash is doing great work in terms of like changing the medical field and declassifying homosexuality as a disorder, and getting the egg test to be like officially banned. I've seen like so many more like artists and like openly queer creatives, but then it's also like in what circles and how, like there's a lot that people are saying, wow, I couldn't have imagined this, but but also that sometimes that gets blown up, like same way we were talking about Tunisia, like sometimes that gets blown up like Lebanon is all gay and happy, which is, not really what's going on. I think that's very like class based in terms of who's actually seeing some of this queer art and organizing, and it can be very like very centric, which obviously is a place to start, but like there's a lot more of Lebanon that exists. And
like gay root sounds kind of cool.
I
can't deny.
And obviously like there's Lebanon is rough right now in general, but I think like looking back a bit, like I see a lot of great work that's been done because of the ability to organize more publicly and have registered NGOs. And I feel like in general, kind of censorship of expression in Lebanon is just very like flaky and on off. So, there's been like certain attacks, but then there's also a lot of stuff that just doesn't get addressed. So like that's, it's a threat, but it's not a block.
Right.
From my perception.
And then as for Egypt, I think like I don't know, I know I can't like speak on too personal of a level, but I don't know, Sarah Hagazi's death, I think, was just a reminder. Like
I think one thing I've realized from talking to more people involved in activism in Egypt is like that it wasn't always like this, like there was a time when, which I mean we know, but it's easy to kind of forget it, that like there was a time when Egypt was considered like more sexually liberal and open
Right.
and
Like
open
progress
for
is
organizers.
so not
Yeah.
linear. It's just such a reminder.
And I think,
Yeah.
you know, sometimes like recently cracking down on queer rights is just a way for governments to like flex and show they have power.
Yeah.
And just make a like a swing at a group that's unpopular in order, you know. And I think like more obviously there's religious I don't want to like get too far out of my lane, but like obviously religious conservatism is a source of homophobia, but then there's also just like using queer people as kind of a prop to swing around. Like we want to show that we have power, we want to show that we can like assert conformity, we want to maybe like throw a bone to religious conservatives, and using crackdowns on queer people just as a mechanism with just like with tragic effects.
Right.
But I think I see that as a lot of what's happened in Egypt lately.
Right. And I'll just revisit one last thing about Saudi Arabia. I've from what I have heard too and like seen is that a lot of like any public expression of one's identity as queer is often seen as like making a political statement that pushes back against the government, even if that's not what the person is doing. And I think that's what the government uses, at least there and elsewhere, where they're just like, okay, you're.
Yeah, I think it kind of match. I don't know what the laws specifically are in Saudi, but I feel like a lot of places, like people don't get attacked under like a law about sexuality. Like I know in Lebanon it's like sex against nature, but like in other places it's more like disturbance of the peace, or just things related to being disruptive or anti-government. And I think it says something that people put like queer expression under that.
Yeah. Even if it's not like a literal statement against the government that the person's making, like there is that connection. That
God, what's the word? There's a word I'm trying to think that's a literal charge, and it's not like disturbance of the
like
peace.
Deviance or something.
It's slipping me, but you know what I mean.
Like a very generic.
Like you're just going out and being loud and weird. That kind of charge. Not something that's like explicitly about sex or sexuality.
Yeah.
It does say a lot that is how the governments themselves frame it. I think that in itself speaks a lot to how it's perceived. On a final-ish note, one of the de facto slogans or whatever, like I would say the philosophy of my own podcast is that the personal is political. And from what I could gather, like this is something that is an underlying theme as well of the Queer podcast.
Yeah, absolutely.
Would you say that so let me ask it this way, are there events in your past or in your present even, like, or I don't know, whatever, that you would credit with really pushing you to being more vocal, to activism, to whatever, however we want to call it, or was it, I'm not saying necessarily that would be like these light bulb moments necessarily, but whenever I ask these questions, like, is there something in your past that pushed you to doing this? Most people tend to have a few memorable experiences, whether for good or for bad.
I think for me, it was definitely that conversation with the board, or the president of this Arab American Center in Houston, and just hearing that, like, those words about the community as Emirati really, it's obviously stayed with me, and it pushed me to like, I just felt like I had to do something to push against that, because I was just, it felt like a last straw for me. I was like, okay, I'm so tired of being othered in like a space where I'm trying to find a sense of belonging, and like, I don't know. So that was like my personal, that's like the most concrete moment, at least for me, where I was just like, it really pushed me to, in this case, like start the podcast and then like connect with activists and artists.
Yeah, I'm kind of struggling to think of light bulb moments, but I think more generally, I think it comes from, there was a time where I really was trying, I was trying so hard to be apolitical and to not be perceived as political, and it just wasn't working. I just wouldn't be seen that way, no matter how hard I tried. And I'm thinking especially in like art worlds, like I'm a dancer and a choreographer and sometimes a writer, and there was a time where I really thought I could like be myself and also just go into art world just being like, I'm gonna make abstract stuff and be really good at it and be recognized for that. And that I realized I would never, like, nothing I did would ever be perceived that way. No one would. Like abstraction is being perceived as like abstract and apolitical is like a privilege that's usually just given to white male artists.
You shared an article about that was really
interesting.
Yeah.
If anyone's interested, it's called Is Abstraction for White People by Miguel Gutierrez.
Awesome.
But I think before that even came up, it was just like a thing that it was a wall I kept running to in my life, and I was like, I've been spending so much energy trying to be this thing that I can't be, so like I might as well just let my mouth run. Like, you know, I can't be apolitical, so might as well just get political now. Like, what's the point of me trying so hard to be this useless thing that the world won't let me be?
And so like, what's next for you two, for the podcast? And if you can kind of plug your pluggables as well, go for it.
So for the podcast, we are starting to think about like ways of funding the platform, just so that we can like continue this long term and consistently and like improve it. So we've been, during quarantine, we've kind of looked at different ways of doing that. So like we've looked at what does it take to get sponsorship, or what does it take to get on a network, or like grants, things like that. I feel like that would, I mean, that's something that we're hoping to figure out at some point. I also just want to keep connecting with people. I mean, and we were talking the other day about like certain countries in the MENA region that we haven't discussed, and it would be nice to connect with people.
Like, what's up in Libya?
What's up in Libya?
And I think another goal would just be, like, we've had on and off Arabic episodes, but I think getting them more consistent again would be good. And I think it's like, and we definitely have these goals, and also it's kind of a project that's just kind of has taken its own direction. Like, I don't think any of us could have imagined it, or I don't think you could have imagined it becoming the particular shape it is when you started it. So I think the more like we build a community, and the more that we connect with people and reach out to them, the more it will kind of take on new shapes.
And it's, and during and then like during the pandemic, it's just so hard to know like
what's gonna happen in anything.
When can things happen? Like, I know a lot can still happen right now.
On the other hand, there was a period where it was just easier to schedule time to talk with people, because
we were all like, wait, we're all at home. So I don't know. I'm hoping to figure out like, I don't know. We got on Spotify. That was something exciting recently, because apparently that is just a thing you need to do if you have a podcast.
It's just a thing to do.
And website is
Pluggables, yeah.
Oh yeah, we're at thequeerarabs.com. If you want to see like all the descriptions of the episodes, you can find us on like all of the podcast apps, including Spotify now. And we have Insta, Twitter, and Facebook, the Queer Arabs. And then my personal Insta, I've started playing violin again. I took a very long hiatus for a different career. Mm-hmm. But that was what I studied, was violin performance. Alia _ and a violin underscores between all of the words. And I'm just trying to hold myself more accountable and play more regularly and get back to it because I do love it.
And then if anyone wants to follow my personal, it's Nadia in her own world.
Nadia's Insta is great. It really is. You like.
It's a mixed bag.
I don't know. I think your Insta is like, you have good content.
Like 1/3 dance videos, 1/3 like very weird memes, and then 1/3 like anger.
That's an excellent balance, I think.
Key components to life.
Hidi, thank you a lot for your time, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
This is cool to connect with you.
Same here. Yeah, this was really fun. Thank you.